Okay, so have you ever crammed for a standardized test and just felt, I don't know, kind of emotionally wrecked, like the whole thing is just off, you know? It's actually more common than you might think, and if you've got that big test coming up, this deep dive is for you. We're going to unpack why these tests can feel like, honestly, a punch in the gut for Gestalt language processors.
Yeah.
GLPs, right? People
Yeah.
who learn by making connections, getting that big picture.
Right.
We've all been there. And today, we've got the amazing Jamie Horrocks, PhD, who's been through this ringer and come out with some seriously insightful analysis.
Yeah.
We're diving into an excerpt of their work, The Stages of Grief, a GLP's journey through standardized testing and college coursework. And let me tell you, the title alone is both hilarious and a little too real, right?
Oh, absolutely. And what I love about Horrocks' work is that they don't just vent about how awful these tests are, though that's definitely part of it. They actually map out this experience in a way that really gets at the why behind the frustration.
And they start with this almost universal feeling of denial, right? When you first start prepping for these tests, and it's this initial, the system can't be this bad, can it? It's this disbelief that kind of clashes with this mounting feeling of being completely overwhelmed by what feels like just a jumble of random information.
You hit the nail on the head there. And this is where I think we see the heart of the issue. So you see, for analytical learners, breaking information down into those bite-sized pieces totally works. But GLPs thrive on making connections, on finding the patterns in what seems like chaos. It's like Horrocks even compares their study mind map to this, like sprawling web of categories, concepts, and details, all tangled together. Imagine a puzzle, but there are no edges. That's what it's like for them.
Okay, wow. Yeah, that analogy is, it makes total sense, but also, ouch, that's got to be incredibly frustrating.
It is. Think of it like trying to assemble this complex machine, but you're only allowed to focus on each tiny screw in isolation, never actually getting that blueprint, that vision of the final product. That's the kind of barrier that GLPs are facing right from the get-go.
No wonder there's that wall that they hit pretty quickly. And that, I feel like, takes us right into the anger stage, right? Horrocks talks about this almost primal scream of, why must it be this way? Which, and get this, is even more ironic given what they were actually studying at the time.
Oh, the irony is pretty thick, yeah. Horrocks was deep in language acquisition theories, which, get this, completely ignored the existence of GLPs.
You gotta be kidding me. Talk about feeling unseen. Like, if these supposed experts on language don't even recognize how GLPs learn, then who will?
Exactly. It highlights this huge blind spot in, I think, how we approach learning and assessment in general.
And it's not just the academic world, is it? I mean, Horrocks also calls out the test prep industry, which, let's be real, is a behemoth.
Right, and they make this really important point that these companies, they're often profiting off a system that's fundamentally flawed. They offer these Band-Aid solutions without actually ever addressing the root cause of the problem.
It's like selling life jackets on the Titanic instead of, addressing the whole iceberg situation. So you've got the initial shock, then the anger, and as we know, grief, it's a winding path, right? So where does it lead us next?
Well, this next stage is something I think a lot of us can relate to, even if we're not GLPs. After the anger kind of fades a bit, that's when the bargaining begins.
Oh, tell me more about this bargaining phase. I feel like we've all been there at some point.
Absolutely. So this is where the GLP tries to, crack the code, so to speak. They experiment with all these different study methods, hoping to stumble upon that one magical trick that'll just make everything click into place.
Yeah.
That whole, if I just try harder, if I find the right technique, I could beat this.
Oh, I know that feeling way too well. It's like trying to squeeze into a pair of jeans that are clearly 2 sizes too small, and you just keep tugging and pulling, hoping for a miracle. But the problem isn't the effort, it's the fit.
Exactly. You got it. And that's the crucial point that Horrocks makes.
Yeah.
The traditional study methods that work like a charm for analytical learners, like rote memorization, focusing on isolated facts, those actually work against the GLP's strengths.
So it's almost like trying to run a marathon when you're built for a sprint. You might be able to push through for a while, but it's not sustainable, and it's definitely not going to let you show what you can really do.
100%, yeah. And this, unfortunately, is where things can get a little darker emotionally, right? Because when those bargaining strategies, they inevitably fail, there's this sense of, what's wrong with me? Why can't I get this?
It's that sinking feeling of defeat, and I imagine for GLPs it goes even deeper than just feeling like, ugh, I failed a test. It feels like the system itself is rejecting you.
And that is where Horrocks brings in this really powerful concept, this idea of the the autism tax, right? And it refers to these additional burdens, emotional, cognitive, even financial, that neurodiverse individuals often carry just
Yeah.
because they're navigating a world that wasn't designed for them.
So it's not even just about the test itself, it's about this like cumulative impact of constantly having to adapt to mask your natural way of thinking just to trade and fit in.
Yeah, exactly. It's like imagine having to translate everything you encounter into a different language
Yep.
all the time, that constant effort. It takes a toll, and it can show up in different ways: anxiety, exhaustion, burnout, you name it.
That's heavy stuff. And it really makes you realize that this isn't just some personal struggle for GLPs. It points to this much bigger, like systemic issue.
Oh, absolutely. When we're talking about the system, we're talking about those underlying structures, the assumptions that shape our educational experiences. And very often, these structures are designed with this very, well, narrow definition of intelligence in mind.
Which of course means that anyone who learns or thinks differently is already starting at a disadvantage.
Right. And it's not just education either. This
Totally.
mindset, this idea that there's only one right way to learn and process information, it seeps into every part of life.
Yeah.
The workplace, relationships, even how we see ourselves, our own potential.
It's almost like we've created a society that's afraid of different ways of thinking. And, I think Horrocks makes this incredibly important point about what happens when GLPs do manage to succeed within this system. Like they jump through all the hoops, they get the grade.
And what's fascinating is that often, even when they do succeed, it doesn't feel like a real victory. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't actually reflect their true understanding or their unique capabilities.
It's almost like winning a game that you never wanted to play in the first place.
Exactly. And that brings us to, I think, the final stage in Horrocks' framework, acceptance.
Which, as you pointed out earlier, isn't necessarily this happy ending where everything just magically falls into place, right?
It's more about recognizing the limitations of the system and figuring out how to survive within it, even if it feels, well, deeply flawed.
So it's less about feeling good and more about, like, being strategic.
Exactly. And Horrocks is, they're very upfront about the fact that this often involved developing these coping mechanisms, survival tactics. Like, for example, they talk about putting all their energy into memorizing just the specific facts they know will be on the test.
So it's like studying the test instead of actually studying the material.
Precisely. And while it might get you through that particular exam, it does very little to actually nurture genuine understanding or a real love of learning.
It's almost kind of tragic when you really think about it. You've got these brilliant minds having to suppress their natural curiosity, their creativity, just to navigate a system that's supposedly all about learning.
It really is. It's a loss, not just for like the individual, but for all of us. I mean, imagine what we could do if we actually valued all the different ways people think, all the different approaches to problem solving and, innovation.
It's like we're stuck in this loop of trying to force everyone into these neat little boxes, and then we wonder why we're not seeing, the full picture of what humans are capable of. But Herrick's doesn't just leave us with this sense of despair, right? They actually offer like a call to action.
Oh, absolutely. They're very clear about that it's not enough to just like acknowledge the problem. We need to actually challenge these outdated systems and, really advocate for change.
So where do we even start with that? I mean, it's one thing to get to understand that, yes, standardized tests are flawed, but we're kind of stuck with them for now, right? What advice would you give to someone listening who's maybe feeling that weight of the autism tax, who's like dreading that upcoming test?
Well, first of all, I think it's so important to validate those feelings. If you're feeling frustrated, burnt out, like you're constantly, swimming upstream, just know that you are not alone in that. And it's not because you're not smart enough or you're not trying hard enough. Very often it's the system itself that's failing to recognize and accommodate these different ways of learning.
Right. It's like, the game is rigged, but you got to play because those grades, those test scores, they have real world consequences.
Exactly. So, alongside advocating for change, there's also like survival, right? And that's where self-compassion is. It's so important. It's okay to like grieve the fact that this isn't easy for you, that you have to put in extra effort, that you might need to find these workarounds that feel, I don't know, inauthentic to your natural way of thinking.
Yeah, to give yourself permission to feel those feelings, acknowledge that burden without judgment.
Yes, exactly. And beyond that, remember what Horrocks said about taking action. Talk about these experiences. Share this deep dive with someone who might not get it, who might not understand why these tests feel so difficult. Advocate for more inclusive ways of assessing people within your own circles, your own life.
Because at the end of the day, creating a world that's more equitable, more just, means making space for all types of minds to thrive, not just the ones that fit into those predefined boxes.
Couldn't said it better myself.
Yeah. So as you're gearing up for that test, remember this conversation, okay? You are not alone in this. And the way you process the world, that's a strength, not a weakness. Keep asking those tough questions, keep pushing for change, and seriously, be kind to yourself throughout this whole thing.
And, here's a final thought to leave you with. If these standardized tests, if they're supposed to be predictors of future success, shouldn't they also reflect the diverse ways that people actually succeed in the real world? Something to think about.
A lot's to unpack there, right? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Let's keep this conversation going. Share your thoughts, your own experiences. We're all in this together.